Well, as you become stronger at chess, you begin to realise that opportunities presented to you by strong opponents become less and less. Whereas when you're playing a weak player, you can almost rely on them making a mistake, and then you get the opportunity to step in and take advantage of that mistake. Quite often against stronger opponents, you've simply got to outplay them. You can't rely on any sort of mistake at all. Nevertheless, when the opportunity crops up, you've got to be ready to step in and take it. That is the hallmark of a strong player. And if it means sacrificing pieces, pawns or whatever, you have to do it, you must do it, do it. A good example of this decisive play was seen in the game Pia Kramling, who's one of the strongest female grandmasters in the world and has been for a long time, and she's playing Jose Manuel Garcia Domingo, and this game was played in the Mislata Open back in 2003. It really is a splendid game, an incisive example of how to crush the stonewall defence to the Dutch. Well, d4 f5 was the opening. White decided to settle for the safe main line, where White fianchettos the king bishop early, and Black seems very content to set up the stonewall formation with d5. Slightly inflexible, but Black has plenty of chances in the coming middle game. And White now plays knight to h3, which is a very good move in this position. The knight is heading for f4 to put pressure on Black's central pawn complex. Now, just dropping back, it's probable that Black should wait to play his stonewall system, just preferring knight f3 in this position. And then if c4, you've probably got to wait one more move here, maybe with bishop e7 or maybe with c6, just to wait for White to develop this knight to f3, and then comes d5. This is probably the best way for Black to get into a stonewall. We'll see that encouraging this knight to come to h3 is actually not a good idea. Black plays knight f6. Incidentally, one of the main Black ideas in the stonewall is to come into e4 with his knight. Well, of course, in this position, White can immediately eject the knight with f3. That's another point of putting the knight on h3. The Dutch can often be confronted directly with e4. So this f3 move, followed by e4, is another dangerous plan which Black has to combat when he encourages that knight to come to h3 in the opening phase of the game. The knight can often drop back to f2, supporting the advance e4. So there are all sorts of reasons why White should want his knight on h3. Or her knight even. Anyway, Kramling castled. I must remember not to call her Kramnik. And bishop e7 was played by Garcia Domingo. Bishop d6 would be a move very much in keeping with the modern stone wall. But in the game Hübner versus Michalczak 2003, White played bishop f4. The reasoning behind that move is that if Black exchanges the dark square bishops, there's a big fat juicy weakness on e5 that Black cannot resolve. White would be very happy to try and target this weakness with ideas such as knight d2 to f3, knight d3, and then the eventual occupation of that square. So strong is this positional idea of exchanging off the dark square bishops that in this game Michalczak preferred bishop e7 at the cost of a move. I suppose he says, well, it's more difficult for you to get your knight on h3 into the game now. But this is where Hübner reverts to another plan. He first of all plays c3, then his knight comes back to f2. White's found a good use for that knight. Black fianchettos the bishop, but he runs slap bang into e4. And with this move, White develops an advantage. That's the type of thing which Black has to avoid in this variation. A quick e4 and his pawn centre is broken up. There's no stone wall here. So going back to our game, bishop e7 was played. White played c4. Black continued to erect the stone wall. And now Kramling puts her queen on a nice flexible square, queen to c2. Black castles, and now knight to d2. Piece placement is all important in a position like this with the centre blocked. White is manoeuvring, trying to get her pieces to the most effective squares. In general, the most effective square for this knight will be f3, covering e5, allowing the other knight to come into f4 with huge pressure on Black's position. Knight d2 would be a much better move than knight c3 in this position, when If you've got a knight on c3, you're basically saying you want to force through e4, because the knight on c3 is not as influential there as it would be on f3. So that's why knight d2 was played by Kramling. Black plays knight a6, and white just plays a3. Not particularly worried about the threat of knight b4, but preparing b4 a bit later on, giving herself extra options. And black can see nothing better than just shunting the pieces out with bishop d7 and then rook c8. So I suppose black's trying to take advantage of the position of the queen on c2. He's either leading up to b5 or perhaps c5 in this position. So that's why the knight comes to f4, dissuading black from playing c5. If black plays c5 in this position, the d5 pawn would remain horribly weak. Well, Garcia tries to get some activity going on the queen side here, but basically I think he's just got to accept that he's got nothing in this position, no counterplay whatsoever, and just play possum for a little while. b5, well, as usual, opening up the game favours the better developed party. Kramling has got her pieces on much better squares. It doesn't look too bad for black at the moment, but the white knights are now moving in for the kill. g5, and here's where a lesser player might get scared about the possibility of sacrificing a piece. Usually the weaker player says, when you ask him, well, why didn't you sacrifice that piece in this position? Or he said, well, I'm afraid that it would not be right. I'm afraid that it would fail. But in this case, knight takes d5 is just immediately decisive. This is just a crushing move, and there's absolutely nothing that black can do about it. We can say that g5 was a decisive mistake. Courage comes with hard work and diligence. You know, if you work hard at chess, you're going to get the self-confidence needed to make these sacrifices at the right moment. Kramling, tremendous experience, knows this is the right move, and it demolishes black's position. The sacrifice is only temporary. After he takes d5, queen takes d5, check, because after king g7, she's even getting her piece back on d7. Rook f7, queen takes b5, the queen's having a field day here, queen e5, check, king g8, and now the simple bishop takes e4 is good enough, letting the white knight out, and white is, 3 pawns up, and must win. Going back to knight takes d5, if bishop d6, well, we've just won a pawn. We keep it simple now. Takes, knight c3. Black's position is falling apart. Numerous pawn weaknesses, which white can just pick off at leisure. So in the game, bishop e8 was played. Kramling kept it simple. Takes, bishop takes e4. And once again, this leads to a completely hopeless position. So Garcia Domingo decided to resign. So I think the lesson of this game is that when you get the opportunity to sacrifice, carefully consider all the consequences, and then if you can't see anything wrong with it, why not sacrifice? In this case, Kramling won the game immediately by so doing.